Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of the Anti-Skeptical Solution, where we navigate the frontiers of research in quest of a solution to the problem of skepticism. I'm your host, DK, and today I am joined by Mark Jago, who is a philosophy PhD doing research on such topics as essence, modality, truth-making, and a bunch more. Side note, he also makes awesome YouTube videos, so definitely check him out. Link will be in the description below. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm doing very, very well. So in this episode, we'll be briefly discussing Truthmaker Semantics and the utility of philosophy. Now, before we begin, Mark, if you'd like to give the audience like a more in-depth rundown of your background, just going through what got you into philosophy, what your primary interests are, and so on.
I was like, yeah, but that's kind of like, 2,000 years ago, old dead dudes, thinking about stuff. And she was like, yeah, but you can actually go and study it. At uni, you can go and, read about what people have said, and you can actually contribute to it because it's still a thriving subject area. You can go and study it, and you can go and be a philosopher if you want to. I think that sounded really cool, right? A kind of a degree where you can go and read what people have thought about important questions and come up with your own ideas and write about them. And if you take it far enough, end up doing it as a job.
Yeah. Nice. So what would you say are your most peculiar or specific interests? Like, what do you do philosophy primarily for?
Oh, what do I do it for? That's a great question. And I guess there isn't kind of one answer. Like, so why did I want to be a philosopher after studying it at uni? I kind of really loved the whole atmosphere of spending your time thinking about difficult questions and then teaching. Like, so being able to spend your time discussing difficult questions and sometimes crazy answers with a whole bunch of other people who are interested in this stuff. So partly I'm really interested in being a philosopher just because you get to do philosophy, and I guess I'd be happy doing that with kind of whatever topics. But I do love some of the crazy topics. I love paradoxes. I love thinking about weird views of the world. Weird views of the world that you get coming out of physics, let's say, like that say the world is completely different from the way it seems to us in an everyday sense. So how do we think about those kind of things philosophically? And how do we reason about the world? So thinking about things logically. Once you start getting into that stuff, you realize there's loads of crazy logics out there, and it's like, how do you make sense of those really crazy but interesting ones? I guess that's the kind of stuff that I'm that really kind of keeps me interested.
Nice. Yeah, so what brought you to the specific specializations that you have in your research?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess most people get to where they get to based on the kind of things they're interested in, just before they start doing any research. So, as an undergrad, I loved language. I loved logic, and I loved the kind of technical nature of how, I was doing a philosophy degree, but it also seemed a bit like I was doing something a bit more like computer programming, or like, it's not really mathsy. It's more like kind of if you're trying to write some code to try and kind of work out something that somebody hasn't worked out before. That's kind of what logic feels like. But I loved the way that I could, in one day in an undergrad class, I could do some ethics, some metaphysics, and then I'd go off to the computer labs and, do this kind of weird logic-y programming stuff. That mix of stuff really excited me. So I guess I've ended up getting into topics where there's that same kind of mix, right? So bits of metaphysics that draw on crazy theories of what the world is like, but also language, how we think and how we use language and what meaning is, and also tying that into I guess unusual forms of logic that really kind of push technical abilities and stuff like that. Being able to do all of that stuff together and bring it together, I think that's kind of what I'm really interested in.
Loving it. Absolutely love it. So when it comes to things like what you're doing in research, particularly on Truthmaker Semantics, could you potentially walk the audience through what exactly Truthmaker Semantics is, what it does, and what problems?
Okay,
they
let
aim to
me
solve?
talk you through. Yeah, let me talk you through Truthmaker Semantics. So this is going to be a kind of an involved answer. So we're going to have to roll back a bit. So,
Sure.
mid 20th century philosophy, lots of philosophers are trying to get grips with a whole bunch of concepts like meaning and modality. So that's theory of possibility and necessity and thoughts, and also trying to understand a whole bunch of different logics that people hadn't really understood very well before. And it turned out that one approach kind of did really, really well with all of these different things. Possible world semantics. Started around the middle of the 20th century, got really big in like the 80s, 90s, still going really strong today. Possible world semantics is this approach to meaning that kind of, it just basically had really, it linked in with computer science, with logic, with artificial intelligence, maths, computer programming, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, the whole lot. It's both a logic, it's a formal logic that you can reason about. It's also a philosophical approach that you can use to think about meaning and thoughts and metaphysics and loads of stuff. It's really, I think it's one of philosophy's big success stories because it's broken out of philosophy and people do it all over the world in all different subjects.
Yeah.
There's a few problems with it. And the big one is it's kind of quite coarse-grained. So you take two sentences that are logically equivalent. Possible world semantics basically says they're the same. They mean the same thing. There's no important difference between them. And in a lot of cases, that looks to be problematic. If you're thinking about, meaning, obviously, take two logical truths, like a mathematical truth, 1 and 1 is 2, and a logical truth, like either it's going to be sunny or it's not. They obviously mean different things. You can think about one but not the other. You can believe one but not the other. This approach doesn't, make any difference between them. So it's a problem. So you can think of Truthmaker Semantics as doing all that stuff but doing it better. It's more fine-grained. It allows you to kind of make distinctions where you want distinctions, but you still keep all the good stuff. So you still keep all the interesting logic, like really, really interesting logic that people are just kind of working out, now, like the last couple of years. Really interesting approach to meaning, to language, loads and loads of applications, and it's a brand new topic. So, a new topic in philosophy is, it's quite an exciting thing.
Yeah. Now, when do you think, if you were to take a guess, that Truthmaker Semantics could potentially either replace Possible World Semantics as the new standard?
Oh, that's a great question. And I don't know whether the aim would be to kind of replace it as the new standard. I guess it's kind of adding to it because in some ways it builds on it. And, for instance, I think Truthmaker Semantics is great, but it's complicated. So, give you an analogy, right? I think there's some logics that do things better than classical logic. Classical logic is the basic truth table thing that you learn in first year in philosophy or maths or whatever. Other logics do things in a much kind of more nuanced way, but they're super difficult. So definitely when I kind of research logic, I'm doing the kind of interesting non-classical stuff. But for teaching, definitely start with classical logic because you need that kind of easier route into understanding stuff. And that's probably the same with Truthmaker Semantics. You don't want to drop straight in there.
Yeah,
you want to learn the basic stuff first. Then it's kind of like, okay, that's the basic stuff. But maybe it doesn't kind of work, doesn't solve all the problems, so now we're going to go on and learn some more advanced, complicated, nuanced kind of stuff. So, yeah, maybe it won't replace it in all areas, but it will add to it. When's that going to happen? It's going to be, maybe 5 years, because right now, there's not that many people worldwide working on it, and there's not that many publications on it, and I think things are really just starting to, get rolling. There's no kind of consensus on the best way to do things. That takes maybe a couple of years to work out and then a couple more years to kind of, get traveling around the philosophical community. But there is stuff that's happening for the first time. Like there's conferences dedicated to Truthmaker Semantics. There's like an association. There's kind of stuff that's happening that makes you think like, yeah, this is starting to gather momentum, that maybe if this stuff carries on getting bigger and bigger for 5 years, then it will be like a big, serious topic.
Awesome. Look forward to it. When do you think the first introduction to Truthmaker Semantics will become available to the public?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, I'm currently writing one along with this guy Kit Fine. If you
Yes.
haven't heard of this guy, he's like I think he's like the best philosopher in the world right now.
Me too.
He basically single-handedly kind of came up with Truthmaker Semantics over the last like 5 or 6 or 7 years. So we're writing this book that's meant to be an introduction to Truthmaker Semantics, and it's meant to be, you know, accessible to anyone who's got that kind of basic grounding in logic. So it's not like a first logic book, but it would be like a good second logic book with all the details about Truthmaker Semantics. When's it going to be available to everyone? That's a good question, because as the more we're writing, because the area isn't fixed, like as we're writing down all the stuff in a kind of a textbook style, new ideas and new results and new stuff is coming out all the time. So it's like we're trying to put more and more stuff in here and then working out how to make it all fit together. So the more we write, the bigger the project gets. I'm hoping we can get it out in the next year or two.
Right. Awesome. That's fantastic. I really look forward to reading it myself. Like,
Yeah, I look forward to people reading it and be finished with writing it.
yeah, for sure. It sounds like it'd be a lot of work. Could you give me any sort of examples of use cases of Truthmaker Semantics to subjects within philosophy, such as like metaphysics, figuring out saw tools maybe, or even the epistemology of modality? Like any sort of use cases that are the current...
I'll give you one case that I'll give you one case that I think is a really good one, because it's kind of easy to see how Truthmaker Semantics can do it where other approaches can't.
Sure.
Okay, so in classical logic, you've got this notion of entailment. Logic's basically about entailment. And you've got entailments from conjunctions, A and B to the conjuncts, A, so A and B entails A. And then A entails a disjunction, A or something, anything else, A or C. And it's the same kind of entailment, right? So possible world semantics just says entailment is just adding more, you got more worlds added, more ways that your thing can be true. So the movement from A and B to A, and then A to A or C, is exactly the same kind of thing. No important semantic meaning difference between them. It's just straightforward entailment. Truthmaker Semantics says there's different things going on here. When you go from A and B to A, you're taking something that's like kind of two things or two bits of truth, and you're taking one part of it. So you've got this notion of being partially true. Okay, so I'm a philosopher in America. Well, it's partly true, right? Because I'm a philosopher, but it's not wholly true because I'm not in America.
Yeah.
So you've got this notion of partial truth. And typically you think about that in terms of conjuncts and conjunctions, right? So I'm a philosopher and I'm in America. Well, half of it's true, half of it's false. It's partly true, partly false. Truthmaker Semantics allows you to make sense of that really, really easily. But, classically you're saying, okay, well, that's just about entailment. So from A to A or C, that should be the same thing. So if I'm a philosopher, then I'm either a philosopher or, a plumber. That would be partly true. And it's like, well, that seems like a different kind of thing, right? That seems like a wholly different kind of thing to saying. So being a philosopher is part of being an American philosopher.
Yeah.
But being either a philosopher or a plumber, that's not part of being a philosopher, right? Because one way you can be a philosopher or a plumber is to be a plumber.
Yeah.
And just because you're a plumber, that doesn't mean that you're part of being a philosopher. Just because you've got this disjunction, philosopher or plumber, that is entailed by being a philosopher. That's one weird thing about classical logic. You can go from being a philosopher entailing either being a philosopher or a plumber or anything, where you've kind of lost information. Truthmaker Semantics accounts for that really, really nicely. It's basically got two kinds of entailments. You've got the kind of entailment where you've got this being a part of this, and then you've got genuine entailment. And parthood, it kind of maintains the subject matter. When you go from being a philosopher, being an American philosopher, to being a philosopher, you've kind of got the same subject there. If we're talking about who's a philosopher, we've kept to the topic. But if you start chucking in like, oh, he's either a philosopher or a plumber, you kind of change the subject.
Yeah.
So Truthmaker Semantics allows you to kind of keep track of all these things. So, you were asking about applications. Well, I guess there's a whole bunch of them there. So you're thinking about how do we keep conversations on topic? That's something I have difficult with. Like,
Me too.
talking about stuff. But,
Yeah.
you know, some people say, oh, logic is one thing, and keeping conversations or reasoning relevant on track is a different thing. But, you know, when you think about what makes a good argument, it kind of should stay on track, right? You don't just chuck in random stuff. You want to kind of keep your arguments relevant to the topic you're talking about, on track, keeping the subject matter the same. So that's a really interesting philosophical notion. Yeah. And like I said, partial truth, being able to evaluate partial, you know, sometimes we think, oh, partial truth, it's kind of a bit of a woolly notion. We're interested in, like, you know, total truth. It's either totally true or it's false. And that's the classical logic basically has two truth values, true, false, and it's one or the other, and there's no other options. But, you know, most things we say that are important are probably partly true, partly false. And being able to isolate the bits that are true from the bits that are false in a partial truth, I think that's kind of interesting stuff in philosophy, but also politics and all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, I think that's a good application of Truthmaker Semantics.
Very, very well said. So I think I actually remember seeing on one of the university sites, basically just giving a super basic rundown on Truthmaker Semantics, where it came from, that kind of stuff. I think I remember it mentioning that it has, like, potential applications in computer science. And because I'm a computer science student, like, that's definitely going to be relevant to me. So I'm very interested in seeing, like, what would those applications look like potentially?
Right, yeah. So there might be, and this is kind of like skirting around the area, you know, the edges of the research. So there might be some applications to logic programming. So you know, back in the early days of computer science, a lot of programming was done with kind of you know, in a kind of very kind of logical way, things like Prolog, and that kind of got used in embedded in things like, you know, expert knowledge representation. So allowing experts to be able to input their knowledge, their analysis into systems in a way that represented that knowledge, that allowed the computers to make better or at least less biased decisions. You know, so doctors would put information, expertise about how they would diagnose a condition based on some observed things. Yeah. And then the idea is that you could have a computer chain through these kind of like logic clauses to be able to give diagnoses that kind of takes emotion and bias out of the picture, do it quick, do it when doctors aren't available, that kind of thing. Logic programming is a very simple idea, but the semantics for it can be tricky. Some of that is to do with the kind of stuff we were just talking about, like the way in which classical entailment kind of just smushes together things that perhaps you want to keep separate. Also thinking about things like, you know, keeping things relevant. Like if you're trying to do a diagnosis, you want to keep it relevant. That's one kind of application in computer science. And a slightly different one in AI is to do with the frame problem. So this is to do with artificial reasoning. Agents kind of want to be able to make kind of practical decisions about the world. The frame problem is like roughly the idea that, you know, when we reason about how the world works, we have this kind of inertia principle, so that, you know, unless that, you know, if you kind of scan your environment and then you reason about it, you kind of assume that things stay the same unless you have kind of evidence that they've moved. So, you know, something's in the cupboard and you open the cupboard and you look at it and you say, oh, that thing's in the cupboard, then the cupboard closes. And as you're reasoning, you want to be able to say it's still in there. You don't want to have to keep updating your belief sets based on everything that you've observed in your environment, because it'd just be way too costly. So the idea should be that really without reasoning, you should be able to know that it's still where it was because no one's moved it. And you only really want to update your knowledge, your beliefs, when you have explicit information that something's changed. That's really, really simple principle, and it seems like obvious, and it's what we do. It's really, really, really hard to encode that in AI systems in a natural way, in a way that doesn't just like try and kind of ad hoc write it in. Some people maybe think that Truthmaker Semantics kind of has this principle built into it. This idea that, you know, things stay as they are unless you explicitly change them. So we're not like writing that into the semantics. We're kind of, the semantics naturally has that kind of stuff written into it. I'm not sure if that totally works, but if it does work, it's a really, really nice application.
Yeah, very nice. So what you were mentioning there before, I think you briefly talked or touched upon applications in medicine, like through computation systems. Are you familiar with any of Barry Smith's work, like basic formal ontology and anything to that effect?
Yeah. So really interesting philosopher. He was actually one of the, back in the day in the 80s, one of the original metaphysicians writing on truthmaker theory, but has since moved into much more kind of applied, like the stuff that you're talking about. Yeah, so I would be really interested in knowing what he thinks about truthmaker applications to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love for some sort of like convergence between you, Kit Fine, Barry Smith, and just like all the greats on Truthmaker Semantics and like practical applications of ontology. Because
it's kind of weird because there was a lot of early work on the metaphysics of truth making that I think kind of hasn't really linked in much with the logic of Truthmaker Semantics, Truthmaker logic. So there's Truthmaker metaphysics, and that's like over in this camp. And then there's Truthmaker logic, Truthmaker semantics, and it hasn't always linked up. So yeah, that would be interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now I think we can probably segue in virtue of talking about some pretty practical ends of things, talking about the value and the utility of philosophy. But I want to preface the conversation by asking, how do you take philosophy to situate itself within academia, broadly speaking? Like, is it subservient to science, or is science subservient to it, or what's your conception of that relation?
It's a really good question, and I guess I don't have a fix. I feel like this is something I'm learning more about as I interact more with other disciplines and with different people. So Quine had this nice phrase of philosophy being continuous with science.
Yeah.
You got this idea of a continuum, right? It's not one above, it's not one below, it's not completely separate, it's not the same thing, it's not like one's the boss. And scientists, and science isn't one thing, right? There's, physics isn't even one thing. Like cosmologists and, quantum physicists do quite different things, but we've got a fairly kind of clear idea of what physicists get up to. What social science does is really quite different. So when I'm thinking about science, I'm not just thinking about like physics. I think when some people think about science, they think, we're talking like, fundamental, quantum gravity or whatever.
Yeah.
Science is very, very broad and diverse. And, what social science, sociologists, sociology of gender or sociology of religion, right? That's a million miles away from quantum physics, but it's all science. And philosophy has these interesting interrelations with all of it, right? With psychology and chemistry and physics and social sciences. And there's probably a tendency amongst like 20th century philosophers to kind of treat physics as the model of science that philosophy links in with. Like, we're investigating the kind of fundamental structure of reality, and kind of we take science as a bit of a model of that. Obviously, no one takes that too seriously, in the sense that for the large part, we don't go out and do experiments. And often when philosophers do experiments, they're not great experiments.
Yeah.
Some philosophers do experimental philosophy and do experiments. But as far as I see things, for the main part of philosophy, it's not to be going out and doing those experiments. It's to be kind of interpreting what the various different sciences come up with. And also integrating this stuff, right? Because different bits of science don't always talk to each other. So, you've got one thing coming out of psychology, one thing coming out of physics, one thing coming out of social science. How does it all link together, right? So, if we have kind of psychology of how we perceive time, and psychologists tell us that like perception of time is essential to us as deliberative agents, and then we got kind of quantum gravity telling us that there's no such thing as time. How do we, physicists aren't going to, I guess, explain that. Psychologists aren't going to explain that because they're not interested in how they link up with each other. I think that's a kind of a philosophical question. Like, if fundamentally there's no time, and yet perception of time is essential to our being agents in the world. What gives? And that's that's exactly the kind of question that you want philosophers in on, to be able to even say, what does the question mean? How do we even go about answering that question? It's not like you can just run an experiment. You have to think about stuff. So that is just exactly what you want philosophers to be doing. Yeah. So it's not dismissing the science. And it's not saying, oh, scientist over here said this, time doesn't exist, therefore time doesn't exist. It's kind of trying to make sense of all this really quite puzzling stuff coming out of science.
Yeah, harmoniously working together to achieve like a greater kind of like, grasp on knowledge, making sense of the world, all that kind of beautiful stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's super... what that takes, that kind of working together, is a lot of people. There's philosophers of science, there's philosophers of physics, there's philosophers of quantum physics, and then there's quantum physicists who are open to talking about philosophy. And it kind of... each of these is really a different speciality, and it's very hard for one person, it's very hard for one philosopher and one like quantum physicist or whatever to fruitfully work together. I think you need a lot of these bridge, you need the philosopher, the metaphysician, the philosopher of physics, and the physicist all kind of agreeing to work harmoniously together in a team to really get the interesting stuff happening.
Yeah, I think if disciplines like do not interact in that manner, like we've got too many blind spots that we'd be generating by just like without the collaboration, really. So it's very, very important. Definitely. The thing I was going to ask next was basically, based on your experience in philosophy from day one, first getting that inspiration to do philosophy, what have been the most important books on philosophy throughout your journey?
Oh, that's another great question, and it's just stuff that changes all the time. As an undergrad, Wittgenstein was the big thing. Learning, philosophy in Britain in the late 90s was quite stuffy. It was taught almost exclusively by old white guys from Oxford and Cambridge, and hearing about Wittgenstein felt like a breath of fresh air. I think I'm not so hot on it anymore as the kind of the right way to do philosophy, but it was a very, very important, Philosophical Investigations was a very important book, I guess, for getting me into philosophy. I guess before that, Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy, right? Just a really small intro book. Probably none of the theories in it are considered right nowadays. But in terms of like a book to get people into philosophy that's clear and explains really clearly what philosophy is about and what the problems are and how we might go about solving them, I think that was the one that made me think that's super interesting. Then Wittgenstein. Weirdly, one of the ones I loved most as an undergrad was this logic book, Computability and Logic, by George Boulos and Richard Jeffrey. This really thin little book that all the lecturers had on their shelves. All the lecturers I liked had on their shelves. Hardly understood a word of it, and it just seemed to be super, super complicated and exciting. It seemed to hold all of these, like, as I learn more about philosophy, this is the stuff I'm going to learn, and once I've understood this, I'm going to understand everything. Didn't quite work out like that, but it was a really important book. And then books by colleagues. So Penelope Mackey's book, How Things Might Have Been, that's a really influential book for me, because it kind of talks about how, I guess, exciting metaphysics, thinking about what's possible and what's necessary and how things could have been. That's an important one. And I think in terms of books that have come out recently that I've really, really enjoyed, Sally Haslanger's book, or the collection Resisting Reality, That's a really interesting book in the way it makes links with science, but the social sciences, thinking about social sciences in social philosophy, how we think about race and gender and things like that. That's something I hadn't learnt much of as an undergrad, that I'm getting more into now because, like, given the way the world is, that's a super important thing. So seeing philosophers who can talk about that kind of stuff with the same level of skill and precision that, you know, like philosophers like, I guess like Russell and Putnam would talk about metaphysics and epistemology. I think that's a really encouraging thing about the way philosophy is going.
Yes, awesome. So, I've got a couple more questions. If you were to kind of like sum up, what would be the statement that is the most general and most like representative of your view, what the value and utility of philosophy is, just generally speaking? Just
One
to sum it all
statement.
up. Just to sum it all
Sum
up.
it all up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are so many different aspects to the value of philosophy. It's kind of hard to sum it up in just one thing, but that's the job. So let's have a think. What you do when you do philosophy primarily is not learning about what this person or that person said, or we try and find the truth, but I think ultimately it's not really about getting to the truth of things. It's about going through the process of thinking honestly about difficult issues and trying to work out a way of thinking through things that overcomes the way you want it to be, like, because you want your view to have good arguments and you want to understand the arguments of your opponents. So it's not just about trying to beat your opponent, it's trying to understand what their arguments are, and actually sometimes realizing that their arguments are really good, sometimes better than your arguments, and appreciating that, and then just thinking through, well, do you still want to have the view that you've got, or should you change your mind? Going through that kind of process, that kind of reflective process of thinking through hard things from both sides or from all the sides, thinking through the arguments carefully, almost taking yourself out of your here's what I want to be the case and just thinking about which is the strongest argument here. I think that's an incredibly powerful process to go through as a skill for navigating the world. It's not always the most, if you were a politician, or if you're trying to make money, or if you're trying to convince people that you're right to join your club, or you don't want to be doing that, right? You want to be an effective, convincer of people, almost like an advertiser.
Yeah.
Philosophy is taking all of that out, and you're trying the hardest you can to be impartial and to get to the truth of things, and to get some mutual understanding going on, and going beyond philosophy, more of that stuff in the world I think would be a good thing. Like, we don't necessarily want people with sight. I mean, even if you think one view is right and one view is wrong, you don't want opposing camps just fighting out with each other with no hope of reconciliation.
Yes.
You want enough people to be able to, recognize what is the best thing for themselves, for their society, for the people who are worst off in society, and you want to be able to do that without battering people into going a certain way. You want people to realize those things themselves, and a little bit of reflection, a little bit of philosophy can really help with that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so to sum up, would you say that the following characterization is accurate? So it seems like philosophy has this kind of clarity component. You get clarity through your thinking. It gives you this methodological toolkit for sense-making, intellectual navigation of the world and important concepts, as well as perhaps providing you with the means to ego death and finding a unification despite disagreements. Would that be...
that sounds like a really nice and clever way of putting what I was trying to go for there. Yes, that sounded very nice.
Awesome. Okay. Now, final question before I let you go. Basically, in the spirit of the quote, try to leave this world in a little better than you found it, what would you say is the one research project you hope, by the time you kick the bucket, will play an important role in changing the philosophical landscape for the better, be it a concept, a formal language, a school of thought, and so on?
Well, I would love to say it's some of the technical work, because I'm really, really proud of that stuff I do in like logic. I think it would be a long shot to say it's going to make the world a better place. I'm starting a new project at the moment on atheism, but it's about being tolerant. It's about being a tolerant atheist. There's an increasing number of people in the world becoming atheist, but it's not always done with a lot of tolerance. And religion, it can be done in a tolerant way, and it can be done in an intolerant way. So I'm thinking about the tolerance, being tolerant, being compassionate towards others even when they disagree. So lots of people have said that. I'm definitely not the first. But if that's a book that I can write and people take it up and it makes a small bit of difference to some people, I would be quite happy with that.
Awesome. So I think that about wraps things up. Thank you, Mark, once again for coming on
Thanks
to the
so
show.
much for this. It's been fun.
Been an absolute pleasure. And thank you all for watching. And
thanks,
there we have
guys.
it. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Hey guys, DK here. If you've enjoyed this stream and gotten something out of it, please feel free to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me using the links in the description below. This is only the beginning of our journey, so stick around for more. Much love, guys.